The room went dead silent when the little girl in bed 12 started screaming. Not crying. Screaming, the kind that comes from a 6-year-old with a fever spike of 104.7 and no understanding of where she was or why the world had turned sharp and bright and terrifying. Her mother stood frozen near the curtain, hands pressed against her mouth. 2 residents exchanged glances that meant they were about to call for sedation, which meant they were about to make things worse, which meant Katie Morrison was already moving toward the bed before the attending even looked up from his tablet. She didn't rush. That was the thing nobody understood about her. She moved like someone who had held dying people's hands in the dark, like someone who understood that panic was contagious but so was calm. Her voice dropped so low it was barely audible over the monitor's frantic beeping. Hey! Hey, sweetheart! My name is Katie. I'm a nurse, and I need you to help me with something really important. The girl's screaming continued, her small body rigid against the sheets, but Katie's hands, calloused hands with half-moon scars on the knuckles, hands that had stitched wounds with the same steady precision she was using now, reached for the girl's shoulders without hesitation. She didn't touch her with the tentative carefulness of someone afraid. She touched her with authority. With permission embedded in her voice like a command. I know you're scared. That's okay. I was scared once too. But right now, we need you to breathe with me. Can you do that? 1 breath. The girl's chest shuddered. 2 breaths. The screaming paused. Katie kept talking, her voice a baseline hum beneath the monitors and the fluorescent light's electric buzz. You're doing great. You're being so brave. Your mom sees how brave you are. She glanced at the mother, gave her a nod that somehow contained an entire medical education in a single gesture, and the mother's hands lowered from her mouth. The girl's breathing synchronized with Katie's, her small fingers unclenching from the sheets. By the time the fever had crested and broken, by the time the child had settled into something like sleep, every person in the ER had witnessed something they couldn't quite articulate, competence that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with presence. Dr. James Mercer stood at the nurse's station, watching. His chart was forgotten in his hands. His white coat, crisp cotton that cost more than Katie's entire week's pay, hung from his shoulders like a flag announcing his position, his Vanderbilt medical degree, his family connections that went back 3 generations in Tennessee medical administration. He'd been chief of emergency medicine at Cedar Creek for 9 years. He'd published 17 papers. He'd never once had a single patient complain about his bedside manner, primarily because his patients were too intimidated to complain, and his nurses had learned not to file complaints that would mysteriously disappear from the HR database within 48 hours. What he was watching now, what made the muscles in his jaw tighten into something hard and unyielding, was a floor nurse calming a pediatric crisis without him. Without his authority. Without his signature on the medication order or his voice telling her what to do. That floor nurse was also making it look easy, which was somehow worse than if she'd struggled. Competence without the pedigree he valued was the kind of thing that threatened systems. Systems that worked because people accepted hierarchy. Systems that crumbled when someone in scrubs started looking like they belonged in the room more than the person with the medical degree. Katie straightened from bed 12 and made her way back to the station, her movements economical, her expression neutral. She didn't look at him. That was almost worse, the way she moved through the space as if he weren't there at all, as if he were furniture. Let's get her something for the fever, Katie said quietly to the resident, who had stopped mid-sentence on his phone call. Acetaminophen suppository. 15 milligrams per kilogram. And contact precautions until we rule out RSV. She was already updating the chart, her notes precise and timed to the minute, her handwriting sharp as a knife. The resident, name tag reading Morrison, a 3rd year who still flinched when Mercer used his last name, nodded too quickly. Yes. Right. Good call. He scurried toward the medication cart like something small and afraid in the presence of a predator. Katie didn't watch him go. She had already moved on, her attention shifting to the next patient, the next problem, the next person who needed her to be steady when everything else was chaos. That was 18 months of Cedar Creek Medical watching her do this. 18 months of her accepting the hardest shifts, the worst patients, the call-outs at 2 in the morning that she picked up on the first ring before anyone else even had time to silence their phone. 18 months of her rebuilding whatever was broken, cleaning up whatever the day shift had missed, leaving the ER cleaner than she'd found it. 18 months of competence with no fanfare, no publications, no Ivy League pedigree to explain it. Mercer had built his career on the opposite principle: the louder you made your accomplishments, the more credible they seemed. The more you invoked your credentials, the less anyone questioned them. The more you dismissed people who lacked your background, the more the system protected you because your dismissal of them became institutional policy. He had colleagues at Emory, at Grady, at St. Jude who owed him favors, men with administrative power, men with access to credentialing boards, men who understood that preserving hierarchy meant crushing anything that threatened to flatten it. But none of that addressed the fact that Katie Morrison had just done something in 2 minutes that he would have ordered a medication for. Something his approach would have made worse. That was unacceptable. He turned away from the nurse's station and walked toward his office, his shoes clicking against the tile with military precision. The pattern interrupted itself when he passed the bathroom, when he glanced at his reflection in the small mirror someone had hung there for emergencies. He looked away. He didn't need to see what he was thinking. The rain had started around 7 that evening, drumming against the windows of Katie's apartment in a rhythm that sounded like distant artillery if you'd ever heard real artillery, which she had. Which she would never talk about. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom in Decatur, 15 minutes from Cedar Creek, the kind of place that didn't require much to maintain because she spent most of her time at the hospital anyway. The walls were white. The furniture was functional. The only decoration that mattered sat on her bookshelf in a shadow box with UV protective glass, positioned so that she saw it the moment she opened the closet door for her scrubs each morning. The flag was folded into that perfect triangle, 13 folds, each one representing the original 13 colonies, though that was propaganda and Katie knew it. What the folds actually represented was Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, who had been 28 years old and married to a woman named Sophie and had a daughter named Emma who turned 4 at a forward operating base in Ramadi that officially didn't exist and wouldn't exist in any Pentagon records that had been systematically purged over the course of 72 hours following the operation that went wrong. She reached out and touched the corner of the flag, not quite letting her fingers rest on it, more like acknowledging its presence the way you'd acknowledge a scar you didn't want to think about. The apartment was silent except for the rain. It had been silent like this for 18 months, ever since the helicopter had delivered her to a hospital in Germany, since the classified security clearance had been activated and a man with a federal badge had told her that the operation in Ramadi was now a non-event, that her unit was a non-unit, that the mission was erased and her job was to become a person who had never existed in a combat theater at all. Become a nurse instead. Become quiet. Become invisible. She had been good at invisible. That was the problem. Back at Cedar Creek, in the office with walls that were more glass than privacy, Dr. Mercer picked up his phone and called the department head. Martin Castellano answered on the second ring, a man in his 60s who understood how the institution worked because he'd helped design it, who owed Mercer 3 favors from a golf tournament and a hiring committee decision that had gone exactly the way Mercer had suggested. Martin, we need to talk about the quality control issues I'm seeing in nursing staffing. Mercer's voice carried the weight of someone who expected to be taken seriously, and was. Specifically, I'm concerned about gaps in credential verification. We may have someone who misrepresented their background during hiring. Who? Martin's voice had shifted. He was listening now with the kind of attention that meant Mercer had his hook in deep. Katie Morrison. 18 months on day shift. I've been watching her work, and there's something off about her background. Too experienced in trauma situations. Skills that don't line up with her stated credentials. I'm wondering if we should request an updated security clearance verification. Mercer was planting seeds now, the kind of seeds that would grow into institutional doubt. I could be wrong. But in an emergency medicine setting, we can't afford to be careless about these things. The rain kept drumming. In Bed 7, Corporal James Hayes had arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 4:17 p.m. with a shrapnel injury that had cost him the use of his left arm and most of his certainty that he'd ever feel comfortable in his own skin again. He'd been in the Marines for 9 years. He'd been a combat medic for 6 of those. He'd served under Captain Katie Morrison for 4 months in Ramadi before she disappeared, evacuated under circumstances that nobody in the unit was allowed to discuss, with a security classification that meant even asking about her got you a visit from men in pressed suits who didn't smile. He recognized her the moment she walked into his room to check his vitals. It wasn't just the face, though the face was unmistakable. It was the way she moved, the way her hands found the blood pressure cuff with the precision of someone who'd done it in darkness, in firefights, with rounds impacting concrete around her head. His heart monitor jumped. It physically jumped on the screen, a spike that made the attending look over with concern. Katie's hands paused. Fractionally. Just for a second, as if she was taking data, processing it, and filing it in a place that didn't have a name. Then she continued, her voice at its usual barely audible whisper. Heart rate elevated. Are you in pain? He couldn't answer. Couldn't say, Captain Morrison, I thought you were dead. Couldn't say, we all thought you were gone, and they ordered us never to ask. Couldn't say, your name isn't in any database I can find, and that terrifies me. Katie continued her assessment like he hadn't just had a moment of fundamental understanding. She noted his blood pressure, 142/88, elevated, and his oxygen saturation, and she moved on to the next patient without looking at him again. But her hands had trembled. Not much. Just enough that Hayes saw it. Just enough that he knew. She knew he knew. And the rain kept falling against the windows of Cedar Creek Medical, and in his office, Dr. Mercer hung up the phone with Martin Castellano feeling something that might have been satisfaction or might have been hunger, and Katie Morrison finished her shift without anyone ever knowing that in the span of 10 hours, her entire carefully constructed invisibility had just been threatened from 2 directions at once. The morning started like every other morning at Cedar Creek Medical. Katie Morrison moved through the ER in her white scrubs, charting vital signs, checking 4 lines, her presence as unobtrusive as rain against glass. Dr. Mercer was already there, moving through the hallways with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. She passed him near the medication station. He didn't acknowledge her. He never did, not anymore, not since the phone call with Martin Castellano, not since he'd decided that her competence without credentials was an insult to his entire profession. By 10 in the morning, every resident and medical student in the hospital knew they were expected in conference room B grand rounds. Dr. Mercer teaching. Katie continued her rounds, unaware that her name was about to echo off institutional walls in front of 30 people. The conference room had been built in the brutalist style of the 1970s, concrete walls, fluorescent panels humming with the sound of exhausted electricity. 30 faces turned toward the projection screen as Dr. Mercer stood before it like a conductor preparing his orchestra. Katie's chart was displayed in sharp white letters against black background. Patient vitals. Medication notes. Her handwriting, precise and economical, covered 3 full pages. This, Dr. Mercer announced, circling a section of her notes with a red laser pointer, is what happens when we lower our standards for entry into the nursing profession. The pointer danced across her documentation like a wasp circling prey. Notice the pedestrian language here. Community college vocabulary attempting to perform university-level work. It's almost charming in its simplicity. Laughter rippled through the conference room. A resident in the front row actually smiled. Another made a note on his pad, turning it slightly so his neighbor could see. Our little nightingale, Mercer continued, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of a man accustomed to being believed, appears to believe that basic technical competence equates to clinical excellence. One of the persistent delusions of underprepared staff members. He clicked to the next slide. A second chart. More of Katie's work, this time marked with highlighted sections where her documentation was allegedly insufficient. Observe the lack of nuance. The absence of sophisticated analysis. This is support staff attempting to participate in medicine. Katie wasn't in the room. she was 2 floors below, inserting a central line into a 3-year-old whose septic shock had sent his heart rate climbing to 178 beats per minute. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone for whom this particular task existed in muscle memory, not conscious thought. The child's mother stood behind a protective barrier, watching the woman in scrubs with expressions of hope and terror cycling across her face. The 14-gauge needle slid through skin and into the subclavian vein on the first attempt. Blood returned. Katie secured the line with sutures no thicker than spider silk, her voice quiet and steady. "He's going to be okay. You can talk to him now." But up in conference room B, a resident leaned toward another and whispered, "Morrison." The quiet one, his colleague confirmed. Always looking at her notes. 30 people exchanged glances that carried weight. Mercer had given them permission to think less of her. In medicine, that permission was worth more than gold. It was institutional. It was professional consensus, or at least the appearance of it, which amounted to the same thing. For days later, Katie stood at the vending machine in the break room. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that made your molars ache if you stood beneath them long enough. She fed $3 bills into the slot and pressed the code for black coffee, no sugar. The machine hummed and dispensed her cup with a mechanical hiss. Dr. Mercer arrived with 2 residents trailing behind him like satellites caught in the gravitational pull of his certainty. One was Dr. Chen from orthopedics, still young enough that failure seemed impossible. The other was a second-year resident whose name Katie had learned was Richardson, though he'd never spoken directly to her. "Tell me, Morrison," Mercer said, his voice pitched to carry. "Did you purchase those credentials online?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air like bait. "There's a certain, let's call it simplicity to your documentation. That correspondence course quality, you understand." Richardson laughed. Chen followed a half-second later, as though waiting for permission. "Maybe there's a website," Chen offered. cheapnursecredentials.com. The jokes continued, but Katie's hand had already paused on the vending machine's keypad. Just for a fraction of a second. That was all. A moment of micro-expression that no one caught because she didn't allow her face to register what her hand had betrayed. Her jaw clenched tight enough that a muscle jumped in her cheek, visible only to someone standing directly beside her. She collected her coffee, turned without a word, and walked past all 3 of them. No eye contact. No defensive response. Nothing. Just a woman in scrubs retrieving a cup of coffee, as anonymous and unremarkable as the color of the walls. Mercer watched her go, expecting something, a tremor in her voice, a quickening of pace, evidence that the psychological pressure was working. What he saw instead made him grip his own coffee cup tighter. Indifference. Or worse, something that looked like pity. The break room was empty by the time Katie reached the supply closet 3 corridors away. She closed the metal door behind her and pressed her forehead against the cool industrial shelving that held bandages and gauze and the 1,000 small things that kept the hospital functioning. The darkness in the closet was complete except for a thin line of light beneath the door. Her hands, those same hands that had held lives together in a concrete compound 8,000 miles away, began to shake. Just barely. Just for a moment. She pressed them flat against the metal shelf and waited for the trembling to stop. It took 43 seconds. She counted them. 3 days after that, the department meeting commenced in conference room A with the morning light falling in geometric patterns across the long table. Dr. Mercer sat at the head with his laptop open, presenting new medication protocols for the pediatric patients. Katie sat in the 3rd row back, reading along with the document on her own tablet. The proposal was for a new standing order on amoxicillin dosing for acute otitis media. Standard pediatric calculations, established guidelines, nothing controversial. Until she saw the dosage. The protocol listed 50 milligrams per kilogram for children under 12 years old. Industry standard was 25 milligrams per kilogram for that age group. The higher dose was appropriate for adolescents and adults, but not for young children. 50 milligrams would risk hepatic complications, potential kidney stress, the kind of damage that accumulates in small bodies before anyone realizes something is wrong. Katie raised her hand slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet enough that the residents in the back had to lean forward to hear. Dr. Mercer, that dosage exceeds the established safety guidelines for children under 12. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. Nurse Morrison. Mercer's interruption was smooth and immediate, his tone the kind used on people making inconvenient interjections. I don't recall asking for input from support staff during a clinical policy meeting. The protocol document specifies, she continued, and this was where she miscalculated. This was where her competence became unforgivable. Security, Mercer said, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket with the casual certainty of a man who'd never been refused anything by an institution. Cedar Creek Medical, Conference Room A. We have a disruptive employee who's refusing to follow meeting protocols. The room went absolutely still. 22 people stopped breathing at the same moment. Dr. Chen looked down at his notes. Richardson suddenly found something fascinating about the table's surface. The other attending physicians exchanged glances with the practiced neutrality of people who'd learned to survive bureaucratic violence by not bearing witness to it. 2 security officers arrived in 3 minutes, both black men in their mid-40s with the demeanor of people who performed this task with uncomfortable regularity. Dr. Mercer reports you're being disruptive and refusing to leave, the taller one said, his voice carrying apology. He'd done this before. He didn't enjoy it. Katie stood, gathering her notepad with movements precise and unhurried. She didn't rush. She didn't protest. She simply rose as though she'd been planning to leave anyway, as though this were her decision and not the culmination of a calculated humiliation. Of course, she said quietly. Apologies for the interruption. 22 faces watched her walk between the 2 security guards toward the door. She didn't look at any of them. Not at Dr. Mercer, who was already turning his attention back to his presentation. Not at the residents, who'd learned their lesson about defending inconvenient colleagues. Not at the attending physicians who'd remembered their place in the hierarchy. She simply walked out, and the door closed behind her with a whisper of hydraulic hinge. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the drive home. Katie sat in her car in the parking garage at 5:27 in the evening, with the autumn rain hammering against the windshield in a rhythm that sounded like distant gunfire. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the position they'd taught her in driver's education when she was 17 and invincible. She stared through the rain at the concrete wall in front of her bumper. Her jaw was still clenched. She could feel the tension in her temples, the way her shoulders had risen up toward her ears and refused to descend. Her breathing was controlled, for counts in, for counts hold, for counts out, the rhythm they'd taught her for managing pain, for maintaining function under duress. She'd used it in Ramadi when Staff Sergeant Chen was dying. She was using it now in a parking garage in Atlanta because a man with credentials and cruelty had decided she didn't deserve to exist in his professional space. One tear traced down her left cheek. Just one. Just a single vertical line of salt water that appeared without warning, without permission, without the dignity of sound. Her right eye remained dry. Her hands didn't loosen on the wheel. Her breathing didn't break rhythm. But that one tear existed, evidence that something inside her was capable of breaking, even if the exterior remained composed. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before it could reach her jaw. Then she started the engine and drove home through the Atlanta traffic, and the rain kept falling, and nobody on I-75 would have recognized the woman in the silver sedan as someone who'd ever been anything other than what she appeared to be. The next morning, Katie arrived for her 7 o'clock shift. The assignment board outside the ER showed her station allocations. Her eyes ran down the list and stopped on bed 7. Trauma admission. Corporal Hayes. Shrapnel wounds. Ramadi, 2019. She stood very still, staring at the name, her hand frozen on the assignment board. The world had folded on itself. The past had reached through time and touched the present, and now she had to walk into that room with her face blank and her hand steady and pretend that his name meant nothing to her at all. Bed 7 smelled like antiseptic and morphine and the particular kind of fear that comes from knowing you're still bleeding on the inside. Corporal Hayes lay pale against the white sheets, his breathing shallow, his eyes tracking Katie as she approached with his chart. Shrapnel fragments still embedded near his spine, she could see them on the CT scan, 3 metallic shadows that the surgeons were debating, waiting to see if his body would wall them off or if he'd need another operation. His eyes went wider when he recognized her. Not the quiet nurse in the wrinkled scrubs. Something older flickered there. Something like knowing. Her hands paused for exactly 1 second as she reviewed his vitals. 1 second was all she allowed herself. Then her fingers moved, steady and sure, checking the 4 line, noting the output, maintaining the mask that had kept her invisible for 18 months. Hayes opened his mouth to say something, but she gave her head the smallest shake. Not here. Not now. Not ever. The ER doors exploded inward at 4:13 p.m. 7 feet tall, easily 250 pounds of muscle wrapped in tactical body armor, face obscured by a dark hood, and in his right hand a shotgun that he was pointing at the ceiling as he screamed. Raw animal screaming, not words at first, just sound, the kind of sound that empties adrenaline directly into the bloodstream of everyone within 50 feet. The screaming became words. I need the drugs. I need them now. His voice was gravel and desperation. Fentanyl. Morphine. Get it now or I start shooting. The ER froze. Literally froze. Nurses behind the desk crouched down. A resident stumbled backward. Dr. Mercer, standing near the trauma bay, turned the color of old bone. The armed man swung the barrel left, then right, the weapon looking like a toy in his massive hands. Nobody moves. Nobody even breathes. Katie was moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Her body had already processed the angles, the distance, the threat assessment. 7 steps forward, hands visible and empty at shoulder height, palms open. Her voice dropped into a register that nobody at Cedar Creek Medical had ever heard from her, not a whisper now, but something deeper, something that carried the weight of command. The voice of someone who had given orders that meant life and death, that had been obeyed by people trained to follow those orders into mortar fire. Look at me, she said. Not a request. A directive. Hey. Look at me. The armed man's head swung toward her. His breathing was ragged, frantic. The hand holding the shotgun was trembling. Nobody's moving, Katie continued, each word precise and measured. You're in control here. You have the gun. You have the power. But if people panic, if someone tries something stupid, everything changes. You don't want that. Shut up. His finger was on the trigger. Katie could see it from 12 feet away. Could see the tremor in his hand, the sweat running down his exposed neck. The smell of unwashed skin and something chemical, meth or coke or both, hung in the recycled air of the ER like a physical presence. I'm not shutting up, Katie said, and took 1 slow step forward. I'm going to help you. That's what I do. That's all I do. But I need you to lower the barrel first. Just a little. So I know you're not going to accidentally shoot someone when you don't mean to. I will shoot you. His voice cracked on the last word, desperation bleeding through the aggression. I know you will, Katie said, and her voice was so calm it was like she was discussing a medication dosage. If you feel threatened. So I'm showing you I'm not a threat. See? She took another step. Hand still visible. Face still blank. Just a nurse. Just here to help. The shotgun wavered downward by maybe 3 inches. Katie took another step. 5 feet between them now. Behind the nurse's station, Dr. Mercer was frozen with his mouth open, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light. The armed man's eyes were wild, pupils dilated, bloodshot. He was in acute withdrawal or acute intoxication, probably both, running a chemistry experiment in his own bloodstream. His gaze suddenly locked onto something over Katie's left shoulder. A young woman. Sarah Chen, a first-year medical student, crouching near the automated medication dispensary with her hands over her head. The man lunged. He crossed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbed Sarah around the neck, and yanked her upright. The shotgun barrel pressed against her temple, right at the temporal artery. Sarah made a sound, not a scream, just a high whimper of pure animal terror. Now, the man roared, and his finger was tightening on the trigger. Now or she dies. Katie's hands moved. Not her conscious mind. Her hands. Muscle memory took over, the kind of muscle memory that comes from 600 repetitions of the same technique, from arms and wrists and shoulders conditioned by years of weapons training and restraint procedures. Her right hand struck upward against the shotgun barrel, angling it toward the ceiling. Her left hand caught his extended arm, locked the wrist, and torqued it with exactly the right amount of pressure to make resistance impossible without breaking bones. The shotgun fired. The sound was apocalyptic in the enclosed space. Tiles exploded overhead. Dust fell like snow. Someone screamed. But Katie's hands didn't falter. She twisted the man's wrist, the weapon clattered across the linoleum, and she swept his legs while maintaining the arm lock. His center of gravity was gone. 7 feet and 250 pounds of muscle hit the ground face first with a sound like a car door slamming. Katie's knee went to his spine. Her hands controlled his arm at an angle that made resistance produce immediate pain, the kind of pain that teaches a body not to resist. "Security," she said quietly. "Now." Her face showed absolutely nothing. Not anger. Not fear. Not the adrenaline spike that should have made her hands shake. Just clinical efficiency, the same expression she wore while checking medication concentrations or adjusting for drips. The armed man writhed and cursed, spitting blood onto the tile. Sarah Chen had collapsed against the wall and was sobbing, the kind of sobbing that comes from the body remembering that it had been 3 seconds away from a physical trauma it might not have survived. A trauma surgeon nearby was already assessing her, hands moving to check for obvious injuries. Security arrived 45 seconds later. 3 officers in grey uniforms, radios crackling, protocols snapping into place. They took custody of the armed man, cuffed him, read him his rights in the flat professional tones of people who had done this before. An officer approached Katie, asked if she was okay, made a note of her statement. He grabbed her. I disarmed him. I restrained him. Simple. Factual. Complete. Katie stood, brushed dust and concrete fragments from her scrubs, and walked back to bed 7 as if nothing had happened. Hayes was watching her with an expression of awed recognition, like he was looking at someone he thought had died years ago. She checked his full line. Adjusted the monitor. Made a note in his chart. How's the pain? She asked him quietly. Captain, he whispered, and there was something in his voice like resurrection. You. Call button if you need anything, she said, and turned away before he could finish. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer was already pulling out his phone, his fingers moving with the jerky precision of pure rage. His face had gone from white to a mottled red that made the veins in his neck stand out like cables. He walked toward the medication dispensary, away from the main ER, speaking quietly into the phone. Katie caught fragments as she passed, my sources at the licensing board. And unauthorized use of force. And I have documentation. The voice of someone who had just watched his authority shattered in front of the entire ER, and who was making a calculation about how to rebuild it, or burn everything down trying. The security footage played on a loop in Dr. Mercer's office, and with each replay his jaw tightened another degree. There she was, moving with the fluidity of something trained, something lethal, her hands finding pressure points he didn't know existed. The 7-foot man dropped like someone had cut his strings. No hesitation. No fear. Just the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this before, done it in places that didn't exist on any official map. He watched it a 4th time, then closed the laptop with deliberate slowness. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. From the recognition that she'd just revealed something that made every whisper he'd spread, every credential he'd questioned, look like the petty jealousy of a man too small to understand what he was looking at. And that was unacceptable. Mercer picked up his office phone and made the first call before the adrenaline could fade. His voice came out smooth as a knife blade through silk. "James, it's Richard. I need a favor." The board member on the other end owed him a failed credentialing review, a relationship that had required discretion, a daughter's internship that had appeared out of nowhere. "There's a nurse in our ER. Katie Morrison. I need her gone. Completely gone. I don't care what it takes." He listened to the response, then smiled. "Good man. I'll send documentation by end of day." The second call went to a contact at the State Nursing Credentialing Board, someone he'd had drinks with, someone whose medical license had quietly survived a misconduct investigation thanks to Mercer's intervention. About Katie Morrison, Mercer said without preamble. "Her background check may have gaps. Inconsistencies in references. I'm forwarding everything to you. I'd appreciate if the board initiated a formal review. For the integrity of the profession, you understand." The third call was to the private investigator he'd used before, a man who asked no questions and delivered results like clockwork. "I want everything. Education, employment history, references, family connections. I want to know if she bought her credentials online, if she's a fraud, if she has any skeletons. Everything." Mercer pulled up Katie's personnel file on his computer. Social Security number is on the file. Start there. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, thinking. That display of combat competence wasn't something you learned in nursing school. Which meant she'd lied. Which meant she was a fraud. Which meant he had leverage. All he needed was documentation, and he had people who specialized in creating it. By the time this was finished, Katie Morrison wouldn't just be fired from Cedar Creek. She'd never work in medicine again. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he'd just committed federal crimes in the service of destroying a woman the United States military wanted protected. The call came the next morning at 7:43 a.m. Katie was in the break room, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she stared at nothing. The director of nursing's office. Now. The hallway stretched longer than she remembered. Her legs carried her forward with the same measured pace she used walking a trauma patient to CT, but her mind was already running scenarios. They'd have security present if it was the disarming, she could defend that, could cite protocol about de-escalation, could argue the medical student would have died otherwise. They wouldn't believe her, but she could state the facts. What they couldn't know, what no one could know, was that the disarming was muscle memory from combat medicine in Ramadi, from 4 years of training with the 160th SAW, from a classified medical unit that officially never existed. The director was waiting with an HR representative and a folder thick enough to be a novel. The folder was the problem. Folders that thick meant they'd been digging. "Nurse Morrison, thank you for coming in." The director's voice had the careful neutral tone of someone reading from a script. "We need to discuss your recent actions in the emergency department, as well as some questions that have arisen regarding your employment history." Katie sat down. Her hands folded in her lap, steady as operating room lights. She said nothing. The HR representative opened the folder. First, the incident with the armed individual. "Our policy is clear, nursing staff are not to engage with threatening persons. That's a security matter." "He was armed with a shotgun in a patient care area," Katie said quietly. "Security was 8 minutes out. He'd taken a medical student hostage. She would have been shot. That's speculative. You violated protocol by engaging physically." Additionally, the HR woman slid papers across the desk. "Dr. Mercer has raised concerns about your background. There appear to be gaps in your employment history prior to Cedar Creek. Inconsistencies in your references." Katie's throat tightened, but her face remained unchanged. This was it. This was how it ended. Mercer had moved faster than she'd expected, had started building his case immediately, had probably been making phone calls while she was still in the ER with the medical student's hands shaking against her shoulders. "Your nursing license and background check were submitted 18 months ago," the director said. All standard verifications. But the credentialing board just initiated a formal review. They're questioning some of the employment gaps before your RN certification. I took time away, Katie said. It was true. She'd taken 12 years away to serve in a unit that didn't exist, to be a captain in a command structure the Pentagon had erased, to save soldiers whose names were redacted from all official records. The board would like documentation from those years. Educational transcripts, employment verification, character references. Katie couldn't provide any of it. The education had been military medical training at a black site in North Carolina. The employment had been classified. The character references would have been from commanding officers whose existence was compartmented. She was being asked to prove she existed in a way that would require revealing everything she'd been ordered to conceal. How long is the investigation? She asked. Pending the board's findings, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave. Effective now. Your badge is deactivated. Your access to hospital systems is revoked. You'll need to clean out your locker. They had security escort her. That was the moment that made it real, not the deactivated badge, not the words administrative leave, but the young security officer who walked 2 steps behind her to the employee locker room, waiting while she turned the combination lock that suddenly felt like it was freezing her fingers. The cracked coffee mug came out first. Marine Corps emblem worn almost invisible from 1,000 mornings, a gift from Chen when they'd first arrived at Fort Bragg for the operator support course. The half-dead succulent came next. Someone had given it to her on her first day at Cedar Creek, and she'd kept it alive through impossible odds, the same way she kept everything else alive. And finally, from the very back of the locker, the photograph in the plastic frame. Chen's widow at the funeral, taken from across the street, from a distance Katie had maintained because approaching would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant revealing that Captain Catherine Morrison had held Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen's hand while his blood drained into the sand, that she'd whispered to him that the helicopter was coming, that help was coming, that she wouldn't leave him. The helicopter never came in time. But the orders had come through 3 days later. Disappear. Erase yourself. The mission was classified retroactively, and everyone who'd been there needed to cease existing in any official capacity. Including her. She packed the 3 items into a cardboard box the security officer provided, balancing it on her hip. The mug shifted. The succulent's pot scraped against the cardboard. She walked past the ER without looking at Corporal Hayes, though she felt his eyes tracking her, though she knew he'd recognized her during the disarming, though she knew he was about to become a problem or a solution depending on how the next 72 hours unfolded. The rain started before she reached the bus stop, cold Atlanta rain that soaked through her jacket and plastered her hair to her skull. The cardboard box grew heavier as it absorbed moisture. She stood at the shelter, cardboard balanced on one hip, watching the empty street where the number 14 bus should have appeared 8 minutes ago. A woman next to her kept glancing over, perhaps wondering why Katie wasn't using an umbrella, wasn't complaining about the rain, wasn't showing any sign that she existed in this moment at all. Katie's face was blank as a wall. Her jaw was tight enough to break teeth, but her hands never wavered. The trembling wasn't visible because she'd learned 30 years ago that trembling was a luxury for people with normal lives, for people who could afford to feel what was happening to them. She couldn't defend herself. Couldn't go to the board and explain that the employment gaps existed because she'd been a captain in an Army Special Forces medical unit. Couldn't produce documents proving her competence in field surgery because those documents were classified so deep that acknowledging them would trigger federal prosecution. Couldn't explain that the disarming in the ER was 20 years of combat medicine experience compressed into 6 seconds of muscle memory. Couldn't prove she existed because officially, she'd never existed in Ramadi. Never commanded anyone. Never lived in a world where soldiers died despite everything you knew how to do. Staff Sergeant Chen was dead in an operation that never happened. Captain Catherine Morrison was erased from military records as thoroughly as if she'd been incinerated with a retroactive security clearance burn. And now Dr. Mercer was making sure she couldn't exist in the civilian world either. The bus pulled up 15 minutes late. Katie stepped aboard, cardboard box balanced on her hip, and found a seat by the window. Outside, Atlanta blurred in the rain. Mercer was probably in his office right now, making more calls, building his case, activating every network he'd built over 20 years of cutting corners and leveraging favors. He was competent in a way that scared people, not through brilliance but through systematic precision, the kind of institutional power that came from knowing exactly which doors to knock on and exactly what favors to call in. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Katie had spent her career in a world where the rules were written in blood and the stakes were measured in lives. Mercer's power was real. It was institutional, it was networked, it was probably already beginning to reshape the official narrative. And in 72 hours, it would become completely irrelevant. Because some rules superseded even Mercer's carefully cultivated authority. And some people didn't disappear. They just waited. The background check Katie had signed 18 months ago, a routine form with a dozen boxes checked and initialed, finally cycled through federal databases on a Tuesday morning at 8:38 a.m. The flags appeared in Cedar Creek Medical's HR system like red emergency lights, immediate and impossible to ignore, classified security clearance tied to Social Security number for 78-66-4392, active Pentagon liaison protocols, multiple federal redactions marked national security exemption. Within 90 minutes, the hospital's HR director received 3 separate phone calls from government liaisons who did not introduce themselves by agency and who asked questions that made her hands shake as she took notes. Corporal Hayes was being prepped for his second surgery when Katie entered his room to check vitals. The shrapnel removal was scheduled for 2 p.m., another 3 hours minimum in the OR, another round of anesthesia, another risk that his body might simply decide enough was enough. She was adjusting his full line, her touch familiar now, when he looked at her and his entire face went pale. Not from pain. From recognition. Reaper 6, he whispered. Just her call sign. Just those 2 words, breath barely audible. Katie's hands froze on the floor for exactly 1 second. Then she continued her assessment without turning to face him directly, her voice dropping into the register she used only in operating rooms and emergency de-escalations. Rest, Corporal. You need blood volume restored before surgery. That was, Hayes's voice cracked. You commanded. Vitals look stable, Katie said. She logged his numbers on the tablet and turned to leave, but Hayes reached out with his unbroken arm and caught the edge of her sleeve. Your call sign was legend, he said. Captain Morrison, we heard about you. They said you could hear rounds coming and move before they landed. Katie looked at the fingers gripping her sleeve, then at his face. The recognition in his eyes was not doubt. It was the look of someone who suddenly understood that the person they'd been trusting for weeks existed in a completely different universe from the one they inhabited. Rest, she repeated. Orders. It wasn't a request. It was a command. She was 17 minutes away from the end of her shift when the Marine Corps liaison arrived at Cedar Creek Medical's administrative office. He was dressed in dress blues, which meant this was official, which meant Katie's 17-year protocol of invisibility had just been breached by federal machinery. The liaison carried a file folder that was at least 3 inches thick. He read passages aloud to the hospital's legal team, his voice carrying the kind of precision that comes from testifying under oath at military tribunals. Citation for extraordinary valor. Citation Document 78 Ramady CCH 2008. Captain Catherine and Morrison, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, performed emergency field thoracotomy under direct small arms fire, using a combat knife as surgical instrument when instruments were destroyed by IED detonation. For separate surgical interventions. No anesthesia. No sterile field. Estimated blood loss 2.8 liters. Patient stabilization achieved in 47 minutes. Subsequent patient survived 12 years beyond initial projected mortality. Second citation, Bronze Star. Third citation, Silver Star. Fourth citation, 2 Purple Hearts. Fifth citation, Navy Cross. The liaison paused between each citation as if spacing the words further apart would somehow make them heavier. The hospital's legal team did not breathe. Your administrator, the liaison continued, has been attempting to fabricate evidence of this officer's professional incompetence over a period of 6 months. This constitutes federal document fraud, defamation of active classified military personnel, and potential obstruction of national security protocols. The door opened at 10:34 a.m. A 2-star general walked into Cedar Creek Medical wearing his service dress uniform, his chest covered with ribbons that had no context for anyone in Atlanta who hadn't signed NDA documents. He walked directly to Katie's station in the ER. She was standing in front of a patient chart, reviewing notes with the clinical detachment she'd maintained for 18 months. The general saluted her, his hand moving with the kind of precision that acknowledged command authority she legally could not acknowledge in public. Katie saluted back. Her hand rose and fell in the same 3/4 second her military body kept in permanent storage. "Captain Morrison," the general said. His voice sounded like respect that had learned to work in a hospital. "Your country appreciates your service." Before Katie could respond, before the 3 residents watching could even fully process that their quiet floor nurse had just been saluted by a flag officer, Dr. Mercer appeared from the back office. His face had the color of someone who'd just realized his career wasn't being examined. It was being dismantled. "This is fraudulent," he said. His volume was high enough that 3 heads turned. "I have documentation proving her background, her lies, her fabricated military story." "Your documentation is forged," said a woman in a dark suit who'd entered behind the general. She was FBI, which meant the game had moved from hospital politics to federal crimes. "We recovered the files on your laptop. You altered federal personnel records. You created false disciplinary documentation. You initiated contact with at least 3 board members requesting they investigate Captain Morrison's credentials despite 0 legitimate concerns. That's conspiracy, defamation of a federal officer, and falsification of documents under the Federal Records Act." The silence that followed had texture. It was the kind of silence that happened when sound was sucked out of a room by the sheer weight of institutional collapse. Dr. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again as if language itself had become an impossible mechanism. 2 FBI agents moved on either side of him with the kind of physical confidence that meant handcuffs were not a question. They were a procedure. "You have the right to remain silent," one of them began, and the words echoed off the tile walls like a metronome marking time. Dr. Mercer protested, his voice rising from dignified denial to angry insistence to something closer to the sound an animal makes when it realizes it's cornered, all the way past the trauma bays, past the waiting room where patients looked up from their phones, past the entrance where his 15-year reign as the unchallenged authority ended with the blue lights of federal vehicles rotating against the building's glass doors. 48 hours later, Katie received a call at 7 a.m. The hospital wanted to meet with her before the morning shift. When she arrived at the administrative office, she found the chief medical officer, 2 board members, and a woman from HR holding a folder that was thicker than any patient chart. "We owe you an apology," the CMO said. "Multiple apologies. We're offering full reinstatement, back pay for the 6 months of administrative leave, and we'd like to create a new position, trauma coordinator. The role would give you authority over emergency protocols, staff training, and care standards. You'd report directly to me." Katie listened. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face showed nothing. "Will you accept?" the chief medical officer asked. "Yes," Katie said. "I'd like to continue Corporal Hayes's care personally, if that's acceptable." It was. Everything was acceptable now. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book. Dr. Mercer's attorney negotiated a plea deal that kept him out of federal prison but erased everything else: permanent medical license revocation, 5 years probation, 500 hours of community service, full restitution to Katie for damages estimated at $847,000. His name appeared in 3 different medical journals as a cautionary tale about credential fraud and institutional corruption. Former colleagues didn't return his calls. His wife filed for divorce, her attorney citing public humiliation and financial ruin. The mansion in Buckhead went on the market to cover legal fees. Katie finished her shift on a Thursday evening in late November, reviewing protocols with 2 new ER residents, her voice quiet enough that they had to listen carefully. She walked through the hospital where she'd been humiliated, and people greeted her by name. Not doctor or RN, just Katie, with something that looked like genuine respect. Through the loading dock window, she saw a medical supply van backing up to the delivery entrance. The driver stepped out wearing a blue uniform, his movements slower than they'd been when he commanded an emergency room. Dr. Richard Mercer unloaded boxes of gauze and 4 lines, doing the work his status once protected him from. His hands that had held scalpels now stacked inventory. He glanced up and saw Katie watching. For 3 seconds, they held each other's gaze. Katie didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't move. She just stood in the window with her arms crossed, absolutely still, absolutely certain, and let him understand that the person he'd tried to erase had been the one holding everything together the entire time. Then she turned back to her patients. Corporal Hayes was being discharged the next week, his surgical sites healing well, his mobility restored. He shook Katie's hand at the exit, and his eyes held something like apology mixed with awe. For what it's worth, Chen's widow, she knows what happened. Someone should tell you that. She knows it wasn't your fault. Katie's jaw tightened. Thank you, Corporal. That evening, alone in her apartment, she reached into her closet and took down the folded flag from Staff Sergeant Chen. She'd kept it in that drawer for 18 months, positioned so she'd see it every morning and carry that weight into every shift. Now, with her hands moving in precise military folds, she unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note on paper that had yellowed with time. He told me about you. He said you were the bravest person he ever knew. Please stop hiding. Sarah Chen. Katie refolded the flag with exact military corners, 3 points, perfect triangles, no wrinkles, and set it on her apartment mantel where she could see it every single day. The flag of the person she'd lost. The reminder that some debts could be honored even when they couldn't be repaid. The next morning, she was back in the ER before sunrise. Her voice was quiet but clear. Her hands were steady. A young nurse she'd been mentoring asked her quietly, while they were prepping a trauma patient, how she stayed so calm after everything that had happened. Katie glanced at the folded flag visible through her open locker door, then back at the organized chaos of the emergency room. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. She adjusted her trauma shears in her pocket, the ones with her old call sign engraved on the metal, and returned to her patients. No longer invisible. No longer erased. Just a nurse, which turned out to be the most powerful thing she could be. The new ER residents looked at each other, suddenly understanding that they'd been trained by someone who operated in a completely different universe. And they'd become better doctors for it. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button. And comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong? Let's talk about it.